Here's a question. In a world with a rapidly increasing population, how should we build our neighborhoods? More specifically, what should be the standards and practices for land development and design? In this episode, we're joined by Rick Harrison, a global thought leader in land development and design. Rick has completed over 1,200 developments across 18 countries and is the author of Profurbia, Reinventing Land Development from Disdainable to Sustainable. Rick will offer his thoughts on the land development design industry, where it's at, how it can be improved, and the relationship between sustainable design and quality of life. My name is Alan Fine. Welcome to the Global Benefit Podcast, where we promote global wholeness by leading conversations toward the health, harmony, and security of the world. Media addiction is a major problem. Being responsible media creators, we recommend you take regular breaks from all media, including this show, to develop yourself and be an active participant in the world. Excessive media consumption will negatively impact your life, so please watch responsibly. Rick, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, tell our listeners about what a neighborhood is. And what are the factors that go into designing a neighborhood?
When you look at the standard way the world grows, there's very few land planners that are actually just land planners today. That was something that was more common 50 years ago when I was in the business. Today, either an architect or a civil engineer or surveyor is going to act as a land planner. And when you look, there's two types of planning. There's urban redevelopment, and that's generally going to be an architect, and there's suburban new growth, and that's generally going to be the local civil engineer that handles that. So that's one aspect of the design process. So it's either going to be an architect or a civil engineer, and those two individuals think very, very differently. So the architect in the urban redevelopment atmosphere, the streets are already there, the utilities are there, everything is there, and what you're doing is you're tearing down something and rebuilding it, so it's going to be mostly an architectural exercise. When you look at the suburban environment, that's going to be someone's farm, and that's what I'd like to concentrate on the answer. So that is the sprawl or this new growth that we talk about. Mm-hmm. And the process there is the cities are going to have a regulation, as an ordinance, and the ordinance is going to have two parts of it. It's going to have zoning, which is a land use. So someone's farm might be designated a residential zoning or might be designated a commercial zoning, and that's determined through various processes at the city. And so that's one aspect. So you have what's a land use classification, and then you have the type of use underneath that. And in that type of use, you might have the minimums, which would be minimum square footage of the lot, how far the front yard setback is from the right-of-way line to the home, side yards, things like that.
Now, to help our listeners understand, though, when we talk about a development, are we talking about 3 homes, 50 homes, 500 homes?
And any one of those.
What's the biggest development project you've done? How big would you say that is approximately?
250,000 homes.
250,000 homes. Now, why would a developer develop 250,000 homes in one project?
They collected a lot of land. That's in in Mojave County, just south of the Hoover Dam. There's 44 square miles that was collected.
So how do they know they're going to sell all those homes?
Well, they don't.
Okay, well, so are they anticipating population movement into that area?
Well, this was before the recession. Mm-hmm. So the land was purchased at a very reasonable price, and it was desert. So there was nothing there. Now, what a plan does is it makes something possible. So again, that land plan is a business model. So a gentleman collects 44 square miles of land, and it's just, there's nothing there. It's desert. So then what the process was
They're
is
basically creating a city.
it is a city.
I mean,
Yeah.
250,000 homes. I mean, how many homes are there in the Twin Cities metro area?
I mean, it's a big city.
1 million?
Yeah. The Rancho White Hills is the biggest one that we did. And so what determines 250,000 homes on that kind of land is you need water. So you need access to water is one thing. It's off the highway, so it has transportation. And then it has to have the ability to have 250,000 people live on it. So they did the science behind water in the area that it could support that. And the rest of it's just infrastructure. You would have to build sewage treatment plants that put in the utilities, put in the main roads. So all of that is the type of things that we would help move along for the county to accept that this is a possibility.
How many homes in the United States are built each year, approximately?
I can't remember that number. I thought it was over 1 million when the economy's good.
That's my understanding too, but I think over the last 50 years, from what I understand, it's been pretty much averaging at least 1 million new homes a year.
Yeah, until the recession.
I just think most listeners don't realize that in essence we're building a city the size of the Twin Cities basically every year in the United States.
Yeah, every
and
year.
It's not just one house at a time. There are speculators who are out there and they're identifying a site, and then they're speculating about movement of population into that site, and then you have a great variation of.
Well, they hope it works that way.
Yeah,
they build it and they will come, but it doesn't always work that way.
So, how do they find buyers?
How do they find home buyers?
Yeah, when they put together one of these 250 home developments, how do they find a buyer?
Well, generally, what happens when someone wants to develop land is they have an idea that there's some growth in the area. The big factor would be, is there water and sewer, is there public utilities to the site, or is it soon going to be to the site? Because that tells you growth is coming out their way. So there's two types of land. There's raw, let's call it farmland.
Sure.
And you really can't put a lot of homes on farmland because you need septic fields, you need wells and things like that. So that's what would be a low-density development. We do some of that. Most of the development is the cities have services that come out to that farmland is now on the edge of growth. So it's just natural someone would say, okay, this farm now has sewer to it, or it's going to have sewer to it in the next few years. I'm going to buy that farm, and I'm going to get a plan and be ready for when the growth comes out to me. And that's generally what drives the thought behind someone saying that I want to build a new development is the utilities are coming out. That means that the population is probably going to come out there, but not always.
I assume that these developers also get into some creative financing associated with the things that they're doing also with the areas within which they're doing it, right? And your plan, you'd think, would be a critical component to that.
The plan is the story. So, the thing is, we're always looking at, it all boils down to people. Someone has to back it, finance it. The city planning commission and council, they have to vote on it. If they don't like the story, then they might fight it. But if someone follows the regulations or the minimums that are in the ordinance, they have a hard time saying no, because if it meets all the minimums, it's going to get approved eventually. And that is the problem with the growth, is we have standards that only have minimums, and the attitude is let's jam everything we can to the minimums to maximize the number of homes or square footage of the commercial, and then you end up with these terrible developments. But that's how this country grows. And the system is flawed in a way. But then the financial people, to answer your question, the people that actually would invest and get involved, they also are looking more at the numbers and not at the quality of the development, saying I'm going to make this much per square foot or I have this many homes to sell. But maybe they don't sell because it's not that great of a development. And that's where the problem lies in.
Okay, so in the context of what's a good and a bad development, what is the most prevalent methodology today for neighborhood development?
A developer buys a piece of land. They will go to the local consultant, and I'm just going to talk on suburban, and that consultant is going to say land planning is part of their services, because land planning is an unlicensed profession. It means all you have to do to become a land planner is to put it on a business card. That is the first step in any development. So everybody's a planner. So
there's no certification process?
There is absolutely no certification process to be the expert in land planning.
But for those that are getting educated about land planning?
They're not.
They're not, okay.
So,
is there a prevalent methodology that's being pushed upon land planners?
You look at the ordinances, you see the minimums, and you jam as many units in as you can on that site, and that's land planning. That's all you need to know.
And what percentage of developments is produced by these people who have no experience?
Almost all.
Wow.
So what happens is the money is made on the engineering and the surveying fees, not the planning fees. So most consultants will throw the planning in at a very low cost or no cost to get the lucrative engineering and surveying fees. And all they have to do is follow the regulatory minimums and submit a plan, and that produces the cookie-cutter world that we live in.
So they just basically take a piece of paper and write out a grid and try to stick as many homes on the grid as possible? Is that what they do?
Everybody's going to be a little bit different, but in their mind, what they think is they have to maximize the number of units because they're getting paid by a developer who's in their mind is they're running the number. I have to have the maximum number of homes possible or the maximum square footage of commercial to make my profit. And at the end of the day, that process is flawed because you're only looking at the end number. Now, some people are going to be more involved and throw some curves here and there and do something a little bit more of character. Sometimes you have to do something more of character because you have to work around topography and wetland and lakes and ponds, and that forces something to be a not grid or something more attractive. Mm-hmm. But it all boils down to a planner's task is to jam as many units as possible on a site to make the developer happy, and that's where the system gets flawed.
Okay, but it seems like if there's an enormous amount of density pushed into a site, people might not want to buy those homes or live in those areas because of that. Well, unless there's no choice, I suppose. Or
it depends on the cost and the character of the development. That's what I was saying earlier, is it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be successful. There are a lot, for example, of developments here in the Twin Cities that are basically empty because there's commercial that's hard to get to that's on the bottom of residential, but it was the thing to do is to put these maze-like projects together that no one wants to be in on commercial.
So there's basically some ghost towns in essence.
You've got
metro areas.
You've got West End that is mostly empty, or businesses that are out of business. As far as the commercial goes, you've got Wayzata Bay. Now, West End's been over there for over a decade. Mm-hmm. Wayzata Bay is a gorgeous development. Lund's was there for, 6 months before they went out? But business has to be accessible easily by car,
okay,
and it has to be visible. And these projects are not laid out that way. So by design, they're flawed.
Well, you'd think then that this is an incredibly unwise choice to just give this responsibility to somebody who doesn't understand the dynamics of building a community.
Well, they read a book. I mean, we wrote a book,
right?
Everybody, and they look at this theory that we should be out of our cars and we have to walk everywhere and we have to be in high density and everything should be close and walkable. But the fact is, you need a really good high-density population to support that, and you need to be in better weather than Minnesota for sure to support it.
So in academic institutions, what type of methodology is prevalently being taught to architectural students with regard to land development?
Well, when you look at the universities that are teaching today, it's the most prevalent thing is new urbanism. Is the word suburb is just an evil thing, is we shouldn't have new suburbs. And the recession, the new urban movement was, celebrating the death of the suburbs. Well, the suburbs are back, and the suburbs will always be there. And the problem is students aren't being taught anything about suburban design. It just happens. And that's where the majority of the growth is. And that's a huge problem we face today, is the quality of the growth. And they talk about how the suburbs aren't walkable and you got to drive everywhere. Well, why don't you just fix them? And that's where, we've been working in saying there's problems there, but don't push everybody into high rise. It's just, when did it become evil to look out your window and look at a yard? And that's evil today.
Well, let me ask you about this, though. In the past 12 years, we've added 1 billion people to the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And likelihood is over the next 12 years, we're going to add another 1 billion. From a land development perspective, it's a bonanza. But on the other side, though...
Maybe.
But on the other side, you say to yourself, okay, we live in a world with finite resources. How do, if we're going to go to 9.5 billion people by the middle of the century, as the UN projects, where are we going to put everyone? We need arable land for growing crops. We need certain land areas, too, that are not going to be developed for housing. So how do we, do we build up?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just asking, because it's interesting. In Minneapolis, for example, we have this 2040 initiative in which they've rezoned whole parts of I believe, the metro area for multi-housing developments.
Mm-hmm.
Some pretty dramatic. A lot of neighborhoods are up in arms about it.
There's pluses and minuses of that. This thing where there's single-family zoning's outlawed. I don't think it's single-family zoning is outlawed. It's just that you're allowed to put high density in a single-family neighborhood. And these neighborhoods that they're going to be doing this in are primarily a lower income. But there's several problems that Minneapolis faces. First of all, they don't even know what blight is. I'm from Detroit. You want blight? Blight is having areas of drug homes burned out, boarded up, homes that's in terrible shape that are worth maybe $100 for a nice, what used to be a nice home. Well, a cheap home here in Minneapolis is still worth, at the minimum, $100,000 maybe? I mean, at a very minimum, in the worst possible case. So if you wanted to develop Minneapolis, you would have to buy out, say, just an acre of land, about 5 or 6 homes. So you're already in the worst possible neighborhoods, you have $500,000 an acre. That is an outrageous price for land. So there's this problem that Minneapolis has is our values are too high for an area that's poor. We don't have poor areas like East St. Louis or Detroit. In Detroit, you can actually buy 400 or 500 acres of nothing that's already been cleared out, where they remove homes, and the land has no real value. So your basis of construction would let you think, well, I have to put a high rise or I have to put an apartment to make that work. And we need affordable housing. But what happens with the value of the rest of the single family homes when they've got some tower next to them that's also a low income tower? How's that raise the living standards of those homes? And how does that enhance the living standards of people that don't have means to be raising their family in a tower instead of giving them a home with a yard and something that they'd have a sense of pride. And that's the problem I have with this attitude is somehow it's the people that are richer, they're saying, yeah, we need the working class to be in the bus, or we need the working class to be in a train, and the working class could be in the high rise. Well, I think the working class needs some place that when they come home, they go, you know what, I may never be rich, but this is a great place to live. And that's the problem I have with the social engineering, because it's people that have things that think they know better to enhance someone's life by putting them in a tower. And I just can't buy that. I cannot buy that. I think if we have a world's population that we have to house, and that world's population grows, a certain percentage of them are going to be lower to lower middle income. Let's give them the best design possible, instead of putting them in the bottom of the design, and give them something that they have a sense of pride.
Well, let's continue talking about this after we take a 5-minute break.
All right, thanks.
We encourage our listeners to take a 5-minute break also.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Welcome back. Our guest today is Rick Harrison, author of Proferbia, Reinventing Land Development from Disdainable to Sustainable. He's an innovator and global thought leader in sustainable land development.
Thank you.
Prior to the break, we were talking about population growth inside of inner cities, the fact that inner city land is becoming so expensive. And I think that there's probably some interests by planners to concentrate more density into inner cities to reduce a series of other types of potential costs to the environment and to society. But the way that they're doing it, we were talking about how they're looking at cramming poor people into smaller land areas through high rises. And we were talking about how this, in essence, impinges upon the personal dignity of the human beings that are living in those developments. It seems like there needs to be an integral professional program that enables people to understand how to link community and the future with land development. And today, from what you've described so far, it seems like there's a total disconnect here.
Mm-hmm. There is a non-collaborative industry as far as the professionals. Our educational system, if you went to get an urban planning degree, is probably going to be more of a social engineering degree, and you might not have any design whatsoever, and you're unlikely to have anything to do with suburbia. And so we
how
don't.
about technical knowledge? Are they going to have any technical knowledge of civil engineering or anything like that in this type of program? Nothing.
So what happens in an urban planning course, they don't discuss the physical parts of development so that the students have a knowledge that allows them to think differently. Also,
so what, when you say social engineering, is that what do you mean by social engineering?
Thank you. It's social engineering is this attitude that we're going to solve the world growth by getting rid of cars, closing down streets, making it difficult to drive, and that will force people into doing public transportation, buses, trains, bikes, and walking instead of driving, because they're blaming the car for the growth of evil and put everybody in high rises so we could just walk to the same place to work and walk home. And there are cities like that.
Well, I notice in Minneapolis, just as an example, I mean, I'm a biker. I bike around the city. I commute. But the key thing is that I noticed that a lot of the roadways, they've cut out lanes for bikes. And they've increased the density of traffic and on certain streets to a point at which it's probably choking the people that are driving down those streets.
Well, that's social engineering. So that is...
And that's happening all over the city right now.
Right. And if people don't change, well, we're going to force it through these regulations. Like in Uptown, they take out the parking. Columbia moved out. It's now some other small business in North Face. What you do is you're planning in this theory and not design. You don't even teach design, so you don't even know design. So the civil engineering courses, they don't.
So they basically just have certain like environmental goals, basically, and then they say, okay, we want to reduce car usage, so therefore we're going to force people to live under these dynamics. So we're going to.
I mean, how
is that what's going on, or? I mean,
I don't see how having a city that's solid rooftop and pavement and no green space is somehow great for the environment.
Now, who proposes that?
Well, this is what this is about. When you take a look at these plans, they might have a greenway someplace in the city or that park within a 10-minute walk away. But when you look at these, it's solid rooftop and pavement. Look at downtown Minneapolis. Where's the green space in downtown? It's solid high rises and pavement.
So when you talk about new urbanism, for example, I mean, do they recommend just blacktop and pavement? And
when you look at the built new urban environments, there's very little green space. They might have a park, but not where you live. And when you look
what happens with the existing topography under new urbanism? I mean,
if you grid over existing topography, you're going to be fighting the natural flow of the land. And not all new urbanism is a grid. It's associated with a grid, and sometimes you can get a new urban development that's not grid-like, but most of them are.
So do a lot of the developers, for example, under current methodologies, not yours, but current methodologies, just they say, okay, we want to increase density in this area. There's this lake here. Let's fill it in. Or here's this river. Let's fill it in.
We can't do that anymore.
They can't? Okay.
Yeah. So when they built Minneapolis, and actually every existing older town, if you flew over it, it's rooftop and pavement and a grid pattern. The grid pattern was because to calculate anything with a curve in it took forever before computers. Today, that's gone. So there's no excuse. But the grid is based on you had to calculate it, you had to stake it out, and things like that. So that is the main reason for the grid. And there were no wetlands back then. They were swamps you filled in. So you bulldozed your way through development. But with the new wetland laws and shoreline setbacks and things like that, you have to protect the environment. So we can't do that anymore.
So how long has it anymore been? Has it been 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
25 years since, the environmental movement, 25, 30 years that we can no longer just wholesale build a city like we did. Now, you can on existing cities, existing urban development. You don't have to replicate the wetland that was once there. You could just build dense. But if you're out on a fresh piece of farmland out in the suburbs, you're pretty restricted on what you can do because of the environmental laws.
Okay.
So if Minneapolis let's say someone today went and built Minneapolis, probably about a third of the city couldn't be built today. And what you would have is sprawl. Because of the new environmental laws, creates and makes the sprawl even sprawl more, because if you're going to have the same density at least, you're going to sprawl out even further because of the environmental laws.
Now explain for our listeners what sprawl is.
Sprawl is that spreading of development from a core or a new city that grows. It keeps on spreading out. For every new development, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. There are ways to curb sprawl without destroying the space that you have for people, but the only way to do that is to be more efficient with the design and not build as much road. And that is the problem with sprawl, isn't that we're sprawling out, it's that we're sprawling out very inefficiently.
So if we were under those same regulations 100 years ago, you're saying the Twin City area would be much wider than it is today.
We'd be about a third bigger.
A third bigger.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what was interesting is when we first moved to Minneapolis, we bought a lot on a swamp, okay? And we filled the swamp in, and the swamp devalued the property. That's the way it was. If you lived on a swamp, you'd pay less.
Right.
And then the wetland laws came in. All of a sudden, that same swamp was now a wetland. It was a natural thing, and it would raise the value of your property. And so it was a change in attitude. It was still a swamp, but now it wasn't a negative. It was a positive. So what happened was when the wetland laws came in, and a farmer had this 80 acres he thought he could sell to a developer, and he thought, wow, it's 20 acres of my land was a swamp, but I can't touch it now. What am I going to do? But that actually became because of this public, I don't know what you call it, some kind of a mindset for the public that they now want to live on this wetland. Those actually changed. It wasn't all devaluing the land because you can charge more for the lots because now you're on this wetland, and now you could recover some of the loss you had from the loss of the value of the land.
If we go back to the programs that you were talking about, I assume they teach about environmental issues?
Yeah, I would assume they're very heavy on the environment.
Okay.
But a architect isn't going to learn the basics of engineering and surveying. A surveyor is not going to learn how architecture relates to what they do, or urban planning. We're still a very disconnected educational system. It's not like medicine. If you're a dentist, you have a knowledge of medicine. If you're a foot doctor, you have the same kind of knowledge, a general knowledge. We have no general knowledge base in the land development industry. We've really been pushing for that, is to teach people, if you're going to be in the land development industry, you should have a general knowledge of the costs of development, of engineering, of surveying, so that we can, how architecture, instead of just plopping a building on there, how's the inside of that building interrelating to the environment around it? It's so disconnected today because the architect does their job. It's not my problem. I'm just the planner. And the planners doesn't, care about the engineering and surveying. But we're never going to advance if we don't have a holistic education.
Well, the planner's designing the future in which we're going to live.
Yeah.
And we're not focused much on that at all when we're dealing with all of these major challenges.
When you look at the industry, the land development industry, and you look at the medical industry, just think that if the medical industry was still selling you an elixir that will cure all your diseases, that's the land development industry today. It has not changed. The regulations are based in the 1930s. Our geometry that was typically used by consultants today are based in the 1800s. The submittal requirements are based on the 1800s. And the issues are the exact same issues today that they were complaining about in the 1950s. And there's something wrong with that.
So basically, they're treating the whole idea of land development as just a business purely. And it's just, how do we set this land up to create density and sell those homes? That's basically what they're teaching, and do it within certain regulatory requirements. There's some environmental requirements here. There's some
right.
There's social dynamics they want to push, but
things haven't changed. Okay, so if you look at a plat that was submitted today, and you look at a plat submittal from the 1800s, you would have had to have lines, you would have had to have the dimensions, the same dimensions as today, and you had to follow a set of minimums. That has not changed at all. The ordinances that we have today are written from standards that were set in the 1930s. When you think about the way this city is built, and you think about new subdivisions, they are a little bit different. But when this city, Minneapolis, was built, nobody had a car. If they did, it was a one car. They had a horse. And yet our streets...
You can see some homes look like they have a horse barn that's been converted into a garage, or it's just part of a wall.
Right. So, I mean, when you look at cities, you think, well, I can get in a car and I can drive in the next hour a distance that most people never experienced in their entire life, just 120 years ago. And its layout's the same.
Are we going to continue to be able to expand these road systems indefinitely? I mean, in the next, I shouldn't say indefinitely, over the next 100 years, what's going to happen to our infrastructure?
I think technology is going to save the day in a way that there'll be new forms of transportation. I mean, I still think we're going to have personal transportation. But I think that when you look at how the auto industry has changed, I mean, I'm fascinated by the auto industry. They respond to problems, and they respond with billions of dollars of research. The housing industry responds to, I have no idea what they spent on research. I don't see it. But when you think in terms of a car today and what you can buy, for example, I'll just say the C8 Corvette that's coming out, $60,000. You got a nearly 200-mile-an-hour car that probably gets 30 miles per gallon, that has safety stuff built in that's unbelievable at a cost for performance that is just unimaginable 20 years ago.
That's true.
You take even a Honda Accord sedan, and you compare it to a Ferrari or Lamborghini of 25 years ago, your average car that anybody could buy will outperform any of the supercars from before. It'll outperform it. It's got better safety. It gets great gas mileage. And we're living in an unbelievable era. Can you imagine how they're going to respond 20 years from now?
But here's the interesting question, though, and this is on that same topic. In the world today, they sell approximately 60 to 70 million cars a year.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about we live in a world with finite resources, I look at this and say, gosh, how much consumption can we stand before we, extend beyond our ability to be able to sustain the resource use globally? And then when we look at land development, same question.
Mm-hmm.
We've got some big challenges that we face, and that if we're adding 1 billion people, yes, it creates tremendous opportunities for land development and for car sales. But on the other side, how do we create a sustainable future? And not just a sustainable future, but a dignified future.
Well, that's the key thing, the dignified future also. And I think the transportation systems are going to change. And I'm not this kind of futurist that we're going to be flying everywhere in our little pod car or whatever. But I also think that rail and light rail, as the cities are spending an unbelievable amount of money on, are not the answer. I think that we have this infrastructure that already has right-of-way, and I think a different form of transportation that uses that right-of-way, that would be like PRT or personal, what's it called, personal rail transport, or I forget what
Yeah,
PRT.
there's some organizations like there's Skyweb Express,
Like
these
Sky,
personal
yeah. I think
car
that's
systems that are automated.
I think that's the future because they're very, very efficient. You can choose your direction, and they haven't taken off. Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv are getting it. They're all like, no city wants to be the first. And I think once that they're established in different cities, and that was invented here in Minnesota.
Right. Yeah, in Fridley, actually.
Yeah, in Fridley. Yeah, and but politicians don't like to be the first. And instead they'll do something safe like, light rail.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at a PRT system, it's 1/4 the cost per mile. It just kind of makes sense on every level. And then it could give some people the flexibility of the transportation, which the car does. And so you have to get something that is competitive with the car. And that's the only thing I see that has the potential to financially be competitive, until someone comes up with that next big invention.
We're going to take a break for 5 minutes. Before we do, though, I think after the break, we should talk about your methodology, Proferbia, and the benefits of that methodology to addressing these types of issues, the dynamics of what community really is, and what responsible land development would contribute to that.
Sure, thank you.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to take a 5-minute break. We encourage our listeners to take a 5-minute break also. All right. Well, welcome back. Our guest today is Rick Harrison, author of Proferbia, Reinventing Land Development from Sustainable to Sustainable. He's an innovator and global thought leader in sustainable land development. Before we talk about Proferbia, I just had a question for you. If the status quo is retained in terms of the way that we do land development today, what do you see the future looking like?
Well, I think if nothing changes, we're going to have this massive group of people that are going to bring up sustainable growth. 100 years from now, 200 years from now, it's never going to happen. We have to have some change because the systems that we have in place and the methods that we're using is just not working. And social engineering by trying to force people into high rises with an excuse that's affordable housing, that doesn't work. And so we really need to look at...
So when you say it doesn't work, I mean, why doesn't it work?
When you take a look at the results of high density, that's mostly gentrification.
So explain what gentrification is.
Gentrification is taking an area that was once either a poor area or a blighted area, displacing those people, and now you've got this mecca that's for rich people. It's replacing downtrodden development with this urban environment that's exciting with places to shop and high rises or higher density that you can just walk and have the social life out on the street. And it's a story that they tell, and the excuse is for affordable housing, and it's almost never affordable.
So where do all those people end up?
Well, that's my question, is where is the articles on how the people who have been displaced have a better life because what was once a place that they lived is now a place that's now a high density playfield for the rich. Poor people, when they get displaced because of new development and more wealthier development, it's exactly right. What happens to them? You know, some of these areas aren't slums. Some of these areas are just kind of downtrodden or lower income. But those people don't stay there. They're not any benefit. They don't get a benefit from gentrification. The gentrification is creating urban areas that are not cheap to live in. You know.
Okay. So
I'll say one more thing on gentrification. Okay. Gentrification, you have to look at the dollars. If an architect comes into an area and they convince the city, for whatever reason, they might even say it's affordable, we're going to come in and we're going to put these beautiful new buildings up, and it's high density with no setbacks, and everything's at this human scale, in other words, very, very dense as an excuse. Those consultants that push that agenda, they're making 10, 15% on the construction costs of that. If it goes broke and it fails, they still get their money. Why wouldn't they push this? That's where their income comes from.
You know, I've noticed where they've done some of these new developments too, they basically, it seems like they uproot all of the topography and they just blacktop everything, and they have literally the housing units go from one end of the property to the other. I mean, it turns into a concrete jungle, basically.
Right, and so that's why we had zoning and setback regulations and things so that you wouldn't fill up the site constantly with just pavement and rooftop, but that's what we're doing today. But who's making the money on that? The more square footage you've got, the more you're going to make if you're the consultant pushing that agenda and designing it.
So what you're basically saying here is that people are focused on enriching themselves at the expense of these communities rather than to the benefit of the greater community.
That's my belief.
And so how is Proferbia different? Your methodology here.
Well, first of all, the Proferbia we call it Proferbia. My wife, Adrienne, she kind of coined that.
I like the term prefer. I prefer to live here. Is that right?
Well, she just thought sub means below.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting.
And it actually comes from the old times when you lived in a protected area the fortress, and people who live below the wall, that's where suburb comes from, were the farmers, and they were outside the protection of the dense urban area that was within the wall.
Interesting.
So we wanted something that wasn't a negative. So she came up with the idea of Proferbia. Why don't we name the book Proferbia? And it just kind of became the collection of methods that we have developed come under that name Proferbia. And so what is it? We are building this world when we think in terms of density is our main goal. Jam as many people as possible to the most minimal dimensions. The only way to pull that off is if you have a piece of land is to stretch the infrastructure or the roads and sewer mains as far to the far corners of the site as possible. So in order to pursue only density, we create the largest volume or length of roads and infrastructure, sidewalks, all the stuff that has to reach that property. So we have the most expense and the most disruption to the environment. What we discovered about almost 30 years ago is if we don't hold to the absolute minimums of the ordinance, because the ordinances have that word minimum. So we started experimenting. What if we went greater than the minimums? What if we had more setback, more yard? What happens to the infrastructure? So we discovered a balance in geometry. And because that we're also software developers, we're able to develop the technology for it at the same time. What we discovered was that magic formula where if you go beyond the minimums and you separate the shapes of where the homes are set and the shape of what the street does, you create this artistic-like setting, but the length of the street plummets. You don't lose any density, so you're getting the same amount of homes with about 20 to 30% less street length. And that was what really started all this when we discovered a different way to do things, and that was 27 years ago.
So basically and tell me if I'm wrong, you're saying that streets take up a lot of space inside of neighborhoods. So if you can reduce the amount of streets, then you can focus more on creating living space.
Space for people.
Space for people.
Right. Instead of saying I bought 50 acres and I'm giving 10 of that acres to the city in the form of streets and right-of-way, what if you only gave 7 acres and you gained 3 acres of that remaining land and just made everybody's lot bigger? And that means that we've got to get away from this logic that the smallest possible size is the optimum size. Yes, it gets your density, but it does so at the tremendous cost of increase of developing the land. So then you need the density to make the numbers work.
So you have a wider property, but you still have the problem that neighbors are just facing each other and the limited view, or
okay. So what happens when you go beyond the minimums? Mm-hmm. Imagine that you no longer have to have the homes religiously following the same direction of the street, whether straight or curved. Mm-hmm. So your homes, each home is a piece of a curve that meanders in and out. And then you have the streets that could take on their own shape. So let
me ask you this, in tradition, what I traditionally see is that there's a setback for all the homes that's equal.
Yes.
And so you're talking about an environment in which there isn't an equal setback?
There isn't an equal setback. So each home forms a shape of a curve. It's a facet of a curve. Each home front forms the shape of the streetscape. So you can meander the street, the home fronts, and the sidewalks so that it's more of a sculpted shape and have that cost less than the normal grid development. And the way that works is imagine you've got a square. And in order to get your homes lined up, you would have cross streets. Let's take Minneapolis as an example. Actually, where we are right now, we have streets that go north and south, but we also have streets that go east and west. The streets that go east and west just connect the north and south street without any homes fronting it. So if you had a situation where you can meander the street and front 100% of the roads, in Minneapolis, the length of street where we are right now would be reduced about 40%. So
But when you reduce the length of the street, then doesn't it take longer to get around? Or
yes and no. So when we first started doing this, some of our developments did take longer to get around. And we thought, okay, well, this is a problem that we're introducing.
I mean, isn't that traditional suburbia? You sit there on this long, windy street. It's like if I got to go to the grocery store, now I got to drive that much further to get to the neighborhood grocery store?
Yes and no. So in suburbia, when you look at, and anybody could do this, just go out to the suburbs and Google Earth the street pattern.
Mm-hmm.
They're not looking at connectivity. They're not looking at on the people who lay these out. Generally, when you look at the patterns, there'll be a little bit of a street that comes to an end, then another little street that comes to an end, because in the suburbia, they have to work around the wetlands and they have to work around the topography. Now with the new environmental laws or they just put curves to curve, to create some interest. But those homes are religiously following the curves. There still is a lot of side yard or a side street that's not being utilized for frontage. And what happens when you look at the layout, there is no thinking about flow through the neighborhood. So we started to look at that problem, and really what it boils down to is when you enter a neighborhood is not having to go way out of your way to go from point A to B. When you look at this neighborhood...
Oh, when you have limited roads, how do you do that?
Well, let's take this area here.
Okay.
And I want to go diagonally across this area. I might have to come to an intersection, stop, look to make sure I don't hit someone else.
I have to go
make a turn.
Straight. Right.
Yeah. If you're going straight from a line from point A to B, that's going to be the shortest
Well, I have
distance.
to walk through everyone's backyard to get there, and then that would fly.
Well, that's a different
right?
thing. So that's a different thing. But if you're driving,
right?
So if you're driving and you're driving diagonal through the neighborhood, you're going to have stops and turns. So you're going to go a short distance. So normal driving to accelerate to residential speeds and come to a stop, that's 400 feet. It'll take about, 20 seconds. In that 400 foot, you're very inefficient for time and energy. After that, you're cruising, so you're very efficient time and energy. So the idea is to enter a neighborhood and maintain flow and not have these stops and turns. And the suburbs do a very poor job. When you look at most of them laid out, they're actually worse than the grid area as far as the number of stops and turns to get home, because they're not looking at that. They're looking at only jamming as many units as possible. Mm-hmm. So there is a science and a kind of a new science, really, about this idea of flow. If you maintain a flow through the neighborhood, even if the distance is a little bit longer to get through the neighborhood, the actual physical distance, but you're not stopping and turning, the time and the energy is less for the average person to traverse the neighborhood. So the secret is to maintain that flow as much as possible and actually have the fewest amount of streets and the fewest amount of intersections. But that causes a problem to walk.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
So what you need to do is look at the walks as a separate system. First thing that we do when we design a neighborhood, even a small one, is we design the trails first. That's the only way you look at creating walkability is you start with a scratch piece of paper, figure out how we're going to walk through there. If it's hilly, we don't want to have to walk up and down hills, so sometimes the topography is the issue. Where are we walking to? Why are we walking to it? Things like that. And then the next thing we design is a street system.
So let me ask you this. In the way that it's traditionally taught today, do they design the walks and the street system first or the houses first?
No, the walk system is the street system.
Oh, and so...
This is the way ordinance writes.
Okay.
It's here's your minimum lot size, and if there's something about sidewalks, it'll be 1 foot off the right-of-way on the street, period, end of story. There's no walk system. Whatever the street system is, that's a walk system. So if the street system's hard to drive through, no one's going to walk through it because it makes it that much harder to walk through.
Is there any political pushback when you're trying to present a system like this versus what has traditionally been done?
Generally, no. When you're dealing with cities,
Mm-hmm.
my main focus is the city council. The next focus is the planning commission. The next focus is staff. And the reason for that, that's kind of the opposite of what a developer would go to staff first, and then they go through the processes. But what's people's agenda? I don't know. I don't know why someone works for a city instead of the private industry. Is it because they care about the city? Is it because there's a power trip?
Mm-hmm.
They can just fight development for the sake of fighting it, or just have it. It's a very powerful position. But at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is at city council. If they say yes, it becomes a development. And you look at the mindset of the council, why are they, even the planning commission, why are private citizens giving up their evenings to listen through this stuff? I mean, it's not exactly exciting.
Mm-hmm.
It's because they care about growth. And why do they care about growth? Because they're tired of the cookie cutter, mundane, and repetitive city that they live in. They're sacrificing their time, their valuable time. So as long as we come up with something that's better than the ordinance allows, or the ordinance allows a lot, but as long as we're coming up with something that's a step above what they're used to, we're going to get the vote. And so the feedback, the pushback is almost never from planning commission and council, because we're going to give them bigger lots. We're going to reduce the monotony, if not eliminate it. We're going to have more function. We're going to have a place that has better views. This is the stuff that they sit on that city council for. This is why they're there. And we're it's like candy to a kid. But we don't know about staff. Staff, for whatever reason, might fight this or that, and there's no such thing as a perfect design. And
So
we're never saying that.
Well, but from a land development standpoint of what you're describing to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that there's a series of key stakeholders in this process, and you need to understand those stakeholders and where they're coming from in order to maneuver successfully through it. In traditional programs and teaching about land development, do they talk about stakeholders?
I don't know. I really don't. I don't think they really teach about land development. I think today, when you go to school, you're not learning the processes like they exist today.
But it makes sense, though, what you're saying. You go to this. If you go to the city council first, they're the ones thinking about what is the goal, and so you want to go to those that are the key decision makers in association with, what is the goal we're trying to achieve here, and get their approval before you start going all the way through the other part of the process, right?
No, they are the last part of the process.
But you want to go to them first.
Well, you have to go to them last.
Oh, okay.
But that's the only important part of the I mean, that's the only critical part. I mean, everything's important. You still have to have something that works better than the minimums allow. Because keep in word, the minimum, all that is going to get you is guaranteed minimal development.
But when you say that these people are giving up their nights, to be in these meetings and things like that, you're talking about the city council, right?
City council those are citizens of the city.
Right, who've been elected. So the key thing is those city council people, are they, they have a certain agenda as to why they're sitting there and giving up their nights.
Exactly.
And you need to speak towards that as a developer, right?
Well, as the planner that designs these developments for the developer.
Oh, right, exactly.
Yeah. You have to feed the reason that they're sitting there. Yes. And they're sitting there because they want better growth. And that's what we do. I don't work for developers that are going to just jam units for the sake of jam. It doesn't help the cause. If a developer comes to us and we're going to reduce the infrastructure anywhere from 20 to 30% typically, I'm not going to do that just for the sake of having a cheaper development. I started my career that way, and there's some really embarrassing bad developments I did. Yeah, they're less ugly than what would have been built.
But it sounds like with Proferbia, you are, in any case, saving on infrastructure that needs to be developed in order to support a neighborhood that's higher density.
You're saving on
roads.
Infrastructure, and you're saving on the environmental impact. Less road is less runoff.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you an opportunity to work with the contour, not fight it. And it gives you the opportunity to place the homes that actually expand the view from within the home. So you have something to look at other than the garage door of the home across the street.
So when you end up planning these new developments, you basically know where the commercial and residential areas are going to be when you're designing those walkways also?
Yes.
And can the walkways, do they go, if they're not going along the street, where do they go?
Well, they'll go directly through the site. For example...
So you make it more accessible for that person to be able to get somewhere by foot or by or through other means other than just their car?
It's like the pedestrian highway system. The highway system allows us to get regionally very quick.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't we just looking at that on even a small site, that basis? If you want to go from this house directly to the Lake Calhoun, you still have to go a little bit of a zigzag pattern to get there. And maybe that the walk system wasn't direct, but it's the ability to actually think about that as a separate system to get easily around the site. And if we're going to put commercial, that's a great destination for the walk.
So basically, you're describing to me that you're thinking about how the community is going to interface with each other and with the infrastructure that they need in their communities in the most effective way first, and then putting in place all of the structures to, where they're going to live and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And that brings up one other last point I want to bring up on that, and that is the pedestrian deaths today are skyrocketing. And what's really easy to blame is our distracted driving, which is a valid point.
Mm-hmm.
But another valid point is 20 years ago, we didn't have the press and the social media telling us, let's get off the couch and get out there and bike and walk. You bike, I bike, and we both walk. And the thing is that what happens is when we have double or triple the amount of bikers and walkers, we're going to have more conflicts with cars and people, even if we're not distracted. And there's going to be more traffic deaths or injuries because of that. So why are we combining both the pedestrian system and the vehicular system solely in the same right-of-way instead of separating the two and reducing the conflicts between cars and pedestrians in the first place?
Or it even sounds from what you're describing that your focus is on the human being and building the community around the person and not around the car.
That's exactly right. Even though supposedly, because we design in the suburbs, we're catering to the evil car, we're not.
Sure.
We're really de-emphasizing that. Versus if you think in terms of new urbanism, let's put a street in the front, an alley in the rear. So we got the cars in the front, we got the cars in the rear. We're surrounded by cars. In the new urbanism, what we're doing is really disconnecting from the cars and connecting more in the space. But because we're in the suburbs, that can't happen. It's you make it pedestrian centric, and you've got a nicer and a safer and more functional neighborhood.
It's very interesting. Well, let's take a 5-minute break. We
Sure.
encourage our listeners to take a 5-minute break, and we'll continue on.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Welcome back. Our guest today is Rick Harrison, author of Proferbia, Reinventing Land Development from Disdainable to Sustainable. We left off talking about the adoption of the Proferbia methodology. From what I understood about Proferbia is that you're focusing on the value proposition first for the people that are going to be a part of that community, not just from an environmental standpoint, but from a public health, a mental health, a human prosperity standpoint.
Right. And that is what's the problem is with our system, at least for suburban growth. So someone buys a piece of land, they go to a consultant jams every unit they can to the regulatory minimums.
I just wanted to correct you, though, not suburban growth, but Proferbian growth, right?
Proferban? This is the way, though, it's the difference. And that is no one really looks at the people.
Mm.
Okay, so the difference between suburban growth, it's all about the numbers. And Proferban growth, it's you start with the people. Everybody that is living in those units that were just plopping down mindlessly, what did we do to make their existence important at no matter what their income is? So when you look at technology, there's several technologies on the market that all you do is you put the regulatory minimum in the system, the software, and as you sweep your mouse across the screen, streets and lots appear. Mm-hmm. So we went from an era where it might take a month to hand calculate a 100-lot subdivision. Now you can do the same thing in a minute with uncanny accuracy. Mm. Back in the old days, when it took a month to do a 100-lot subdivision, you actually thought about what you were doing. Today, we're just conditioned. This latest generation is the software can do things for you. When you look at every mid-rise building that's going up today, it looks like the same architect did everything. Why? Because they just go into their software, whether it's ArchiCAD or Revit, and they just do the typicals, and then what happens is there is no design. To get back to Proferbia, we need to think in terms of, for every one of those units, those residential units, there's a family that lives there. And they're going to live there in the average of 6 years. In this nation, a home sells every 6 years. So that means over a century, that same unit is going to affect 16 plus families in a century. It's going to be there for about a century or so for everything we do. And yet we don't even think about what we're doing. It's just geometry. It's just jamming as many units as possible. We have to get back to we are setting the stage or the living standard for that family. Mm-hmm. What are we doing? Stepping back, taking our time to think that every time we put a lot line in, what we're doing is there's a family that lives there. What are we doing to make that special or unique for that family? And I could tell you, as the income goes lower, there is less and less attention to design because it's just those people. We spend a lot of time designing for the gentrification, but the mass amount of people, the greatest number that need to be housed, we take very little effort. And those are the people that we have to take the most effort. And technology has been working against that for the last 4 decades. We've slowly dumbed down technology to where we don't have design anymore.
Maybe because somebody can just press a button and generate a design without having to think about the design.
Right, and as software developers, we started to see that. So we pulled back and we thought the software should be used as a tool to do something better. I sell software. I've been in the software business for 42 years. I've been developing software. And when someone calls you to buy or be interested in your package, what they say is, how much faster can I get the job out if I buy your software? They never say, how much of a better neighborhood or community can I develop or design if I buy your software for the people that are going to be in my neighborhoods? And that is a material problem with the industry that we're kind of use software as a crutch. And we've lost the ability to think properly and design. And that's another thing about Proferbia, is to get back to the days where we realize that we're designing the most expensive product known to man, and that is the cities that we live in, and not rush through anything.
What you're basically describing to me is that land development is where car development was in the 1930s. We build it, you buy it, versus let me understand your needs, and then let's build something that's going to meet, your lifestyle requirements.
Exactly. And so that's...
And so in schools, do they teach?
No.
They don't teach this methodology.
They don't teach us methodology. I could tell you a few reasons. Some of them is valid. They don't teach the methods and the technology we developed. The technology that is taught in the universities is either going to be like a CAD-based or a GIS technology. It is incredibly complex to learn. It's incredibly complex to use. And just when you look and you follow the money and you look at what it costs for students to actually get a college degree today, the more complex and the more cumbersome the software is to use, the longer it takes in semesters and maybe even years to get a degree to master that software. How many years or semesters did you have to go through to learn the smartphone you've got in your pocket that does hundreds and hundreds of things? Mm-hmm. Why isn't the software that easy to use? And I would contend, as a software developer, and the reason I don't have outside investors is they would look at, well, what's our model? How are you going to make your money if it's easy to use? How are you going to make your money on the training? And you look at the universities, why aren't they adopting these systems? First of all, if you had a software that took a week to learn total, what would they do? How would that work with their classes? How would that work? So what we're saying is there's a different way to do things. Let's take the time. Let's take software out of the picture. Let's take the complexity out. Software should be easy to use, and take that time instead of pressing a button so everybody's creating the same thing and we don't design anymore. Take that time to teach people how to design again. That means that professors have to go back to school. The professors have to learn how to teach the design.
Well, they have to be in the mode of thinking rather than just teaching technical details of how to do something.
Right. Here's your GIS class. This is the GIS system we are selling to the marketplace. Now, the valid reason that they wouldn't adopt this is because they would ask, well, if I teach the students this new technology and these design methods based on that, where are they going to get a job? Because everybody uses the software that's out on the market. And that's a valid reason they wouldn't.
And it's a new urbanism type software versus a Proferbia type software.
No, it's just software, like a GIS software at the city that you would look at the mapping system. Okay. That is based on 1970s technology where everything is a line. So a curve is just a bunch of little lines. There's no intelligence and there's no accuracy to that.
Well, so let me ask you this. So basically the Proferbia methodology, though, seeks to address sustainability issues.
Yes. By
reducing waste, improving land use. At the same time, you're trying to improve the mental health dimensions of a community by improving the quality of life for the people that are going to live in that community through the design, right?
Yes.
So it seems like everyone should gravitate towards adopting this sort of thing.
There's a problem.
So what's the problem? What is the barrier to this?
In order for this to be adopted, the existing technologies would have a very hard time to design and to engineer and to survey something that's freeform. The existing software technologies, that's why we developed new technology. But there's a bigger problem.
Well, so what you're saying, though, and I just want to make sure our listeners understand this, your software works freeform, and your methodology, whereas traditional teaching is basically, here's a grid layout. You're working in a fixed
how difficult
factor
is
type
it
environment versus a freeform environment.
right,
Is that right?
how difficult would it be to teach someone here's a straight line and here's everything is the same distance from the line? It's not very difficult, and it's not very difficult to write software to automate that. Here's our biggest problem.
You're working with the existing topography of wherever that development is going, and you want to make sure you retain the integrity of that topography, is what you're saying.
You want to take and honor the natural terrain of Mother Nature.
Mm-hmm.
That's the cheapest way to develop, bar none. But our biggest problem comes in.
Is it the cheapest way? Because you'd think then that's what they'd be doing right now.
Well, here's the problem. And again, that architect that's trying to convince a city the new urbanism is great because they're making 10% or 15% fees off of whatever gets built. In general, the civil engineers that build the infrastructure we have today, in general, they charge a percentage of infrastructure cost. If our methods were adopted as a standard way to do things, and if we can reduce the world's infrastructure by 25%, what did that just do to the business model of all the consulting firms that charge a percentage of infrastructure cost?
Well, they don't have the consulting fees.
They don't have, right. So they would have to change their business model to be based on being rewarded and charging on the savings and the efficiency of coming up with a better design. And so we have got some real material roadblocks to get standardization because there is profit in waste.
So what you're basically saying is that we need to change the culture and then the reward mechanisms for how we design the future neighborhoods, and that will end up helping to drive the success of a methodology like Proferbia. Whereas when we create more complexity, we create more opportunity for wealth building, and
well, what we're saying is
that gets in the way of the ability of creating this, utilizing this type of methodology.
What we're really saying is there's some basic business models that don't work anymore if we want an efficient world. And what we're really saying is in order to change, it's going to take effort. And what I've seen in the last 4 generations that we've been, and that's the last 40 years that we've been in the technology business, is the world is adverse to change. When we first started 40 years ago and you came up with a new software and a new way to do things, the world was hungry for technology. They were hungry for everything new, and they paid a lot of money for it. Today, they're adverse to change. It's an effort, and we really need to go back to really the days, whether it's new technology or new methods, to say, if we're going to ever reach a better world to live in, we can't just blame the car. We have to look at the systems that we're designing and improve the systems that we're designing. And if it's more efficient, then it's going to solve some, but not all of the affordability problems. And we just create a better world. And we need to get back to that passion and to make that effort.
So part of the roadblocks is what you were describing before. There's corruption roadblocks.
No, I have never seen in our business corruption.
Okay.
On our end of the business. I could...
Ignorance?
Ignorance, yes. We were talking earlier on why didn't PRT take over, and now we've got light rail, and I believe there is some corruption there on high-level government. Because it doesn't make sense. PRT just makes a lot more sense than light rail, but right. I'm not an expert on that. I'd rather concentrate on what I know. And from a development side, I can honestly say this has been a surprisingly non-corrupt business. I think ignorance, and I say that in a kind way, that developers that do cookie cutter and just do what everybody else is doing, they don't understand that they can do better. Is they just assume that if it's different, it's going to cost them more money or they're going to lose density, and that's not the case. So there's this fear of change, but it's a valid fear. But I think that the problem with the industry boils down to effort and passion. I've just seen that change in the industry in the last 40 years. And we just want to do something about that or contribute to that change.
What types of cultural dynamics need to change in order for us to get there?
Our young generation thinks that, and this isn't a bad thing because I think technology's done a lot of wonderful things in our life, but we depend too much on it. And I think that this idea that you can press a button on a computer and then you get some kind of result is somehow magical, and it's a better result than if we actually took an effort to think about it is a bad thing. And we need to get more intimate with what we're doing. And when we talk about affordable housing, like in Minneapolis, and they talk about affordability and they talk about density and things like that, they're just assuming we can't do anything on the land side. And they're assuming there's certain things we can't do. But if we can reduce the cost of construction on the land side in that 20 to 30% range and give someone a better environment to live, then we don't have to go vertically as much. That's the things that are missing, but I just see it, and in the long time I've been in this business, the generations today are not open to change for whatever reason and changing the technologies. And
when you say they're not open to change, you're saying educational institutions? You're saying city planners?
I think cities want change. Cities definitely want change. I think the developers we work for, they want change. I think the consultants.
And when you say consultants, you're talking about?
Engineers, surveyors, architects, planners.
Okay.
That's the 4 areas of consulting that builds this world. I think for whatever reason, I don't see the embracing of change like I did when I entered the business before, decades ago.
You think it's laziness?
I don't know what it is. It's an attitude. And I think software, as a software developer, I saw that happening, and I think it's a dangerous route to go.
Well, the question is, how do we break through that? I guess I'm kind of looking for.
I'm trying.
What's the solution for breaking through it?
We're working with Planning Tank. That's a European blog to furnish students at very, very low cost, essentially our cost, the technology and the training courses. I don't know how successful we'll be with that, but we're doing everything we can to try and change the system that doesn't want to change. But time's our enemy. We've been doing this for 27 years, and we just like to get change as fast as possible. The technology is available today.
Can you think of other models of situations in which there were adoption hurdles to change in other environments that could be a good model for how to address change in this type of situation?
I'm struggling with that because when you look at any other product, this pen, this pen, is a mass-produced product. We're in a business-to-business environment. We're not talking about having a consumer-related product that we could wave and say, we're going to sell 1 billion of these. Essentially, we are, and if we're successful, but we're in a fragmented industry, a ragtag industry that needs to really clean house and change. Otherwise, it's not going to.
So maybe a part of the solution is that when it comes to land planning, I'm just throwing this out there, tell me what you think, that based on what you're saying, we need to reduce the fragmentation of the industry, put together a formal education curriculum and gain adoption to that curriculum.
Yes, there should be a land development degree, and that land development degree teaches the basics of engineering, surveying, architecture, planning, landscape architecture, financial modeling, and with the best technology possible.
And maybe consumer value proposition analysis or something like that, understanding the dynamics of what families and homeowners would like in terms of quality of life.
Well, at this stage, we've got over 1,200 developments, roughly $80 billion in development. You want studies? Every one of these developments, every one of those 1,200 is a study in itself. How much? Sure. We don't need to do that. We're doing it. But how do we get the other tens of thousands of consultants around the world to adopt it?
But the combination of all of these things doesn't exist right now in terms of an educational program.
Absolutely not.
Wow.
I think Europe does it a little bit more than we do in this country.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, and I'm finding with Planning Tank, which is Europe and Asia, that it's not as much as I thought. Otherwise, we wouldn't be, getting involved with them. But, students are going drastically into debt, and it's our responsibility to get them the best ability to compete in this next world and enact change so at least their debt has value.
Well, most of our listeners probably, if we go back to the very beginning of this show today, probably weren't aware of the idea that there are people in land development that are putting together projects for 250 plus homes, even up to 250,000. And they were just thinking that all of these homes are just sort of a one-off thing, and it's just an architect goes and gets an architectural degree, and then they can just solve all of these problems. I think you've drawn some tremendous awarenesses of things that most of us should understand, especially the critical nature of land development to our future. I think these are great ideas. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for having me. Hopefully it gets people to think and we can make a difference sooner than later.
Yeah.